Good afternoon, and welcome to the Triglyceride Paradox, Understanding Insulin Resistance in Black Americans. So the triglyceride paradox is a medical term used to describe a contradictory relationship between a biomarker and an expected health outcome. And specifically, the biomarker is triglycerides, and the expected health outcome is insulin resistance. So a little bit of background information and some brief definitions. So the TG-HDLC ratio is something that is used to assess risk for the development of insulin resistance, and values that are equal to or greater than 3.0 are sufficient to predict insulin resistance in patients. Also, just really quick, triglycerides are a lipid or fat molecules stored in fat cells that are used for energy. And HDLC is the content of cholesterol measured in HDLC that would be high density lipoproteins within a sample of blood. And insulin resistance is defined as the inability of the body cells to respond to the hormone insulin in order to remove amounts of glucose from the bloodstream. So why is this important? So this is important because investigators and researchers has found a link between insulin resistance, the onset of diabetes, and the potential to contract cardiovascular disease. And so how does this pertain to the Black population? Well, Black people get diabetes at a 60% higher rate than white people. And so this increases the risk of heart disease. So basically, the medical establishment has determined that high levels of triglycerides, or also known as triglyceridemia, are important risk factors for assessing for assessing the risk for developing insulin resistance, and also which could potentially lead to diabetes. Going back to the fact that this is a paradox, because it's a paradox because in Caucasian Americans, those Caucasian Americans with insulin resistance tend to have higher levels of triglycerides and lower HDLC levels, and Black Americans with insulin resistance, we see an inverse relationship. So we see actually low to normal triglycerides and elevated levels of HDLC. And so these racial differences in triglycerides highlight the importance of conducting more multi-ethnic studies. What we have here is a figure produced by the Center for Disease Control and the National Diabetes Statistics Report. So this is a report assessing across multiple ethnic groups. So we have non-Hispanic Blacks, non-Hispanic Asians. We also have an indigenous population and non-Hispanic whites. And so each year, as we can see here, the two highest percentages of diagnoses are associated with two communities. That's the indigenous population and the Black American population. And so they also concluded that communities of color experience, which consider that communities of color that experiences higher rates of racism and discrimination, they tend to have an increased risk of developing diabetes. health disparities in the Black community are potentially made worse by the exclusion from research. And to highlight this, this is exemplified by the fact that a lot of the classical investigations that have contributed to our knowledge of insulin resistance and diabetes, they all come from studies whose cohorts consisted of more than 90% of white patients. And so there was a huge exclusion there of data from diverse populations. So it's important to outline some objectives, to which I have three. Number one is to determine what screening tests more accurately assess insulin resistance in the Black population. The second would be to identify other biomarkers other than insulin resistance. And the third would be to investigate the link between insulin resistance, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in Black Americans. So I have three questions in regard to this topic. The first is, are more Black Americans undiagnosed with insulin resistance due to the utilization of the TG-HDLC ratio? Also, is there another alternative biomarker that we can measure broadly across diverse ethnic populations to assess insulin resistance? Third, would increasing the efficacy in insulin resistance screening lower the prevalence of diabetes and the risk of developing cardiovascular disease? So it's important to outline some goals here as well. The first would be to identify Black Americans in the U.S. population living with insulin resistance. Number two would be to investigate the biomarkers other than triglycerides with insulin resistance and progression of diabetes. And third, it would be to determine the link between insulin resistance and the development of cardiovascular diseases. So now is a good time, I think, to backtrack a little bit and highlight my objectives, which I feel I may get some resistance there because there's potential to run into some problems here. So I wanted to address them. And so when we're evaluating screening tests for insulin resistance, at least evaluating those that we believe might be more accurate, there are other screening tests such as waist circumference measurements, BMI, and tests for hypertension. But those markers vary. They also vary widely across multiple groups and populations. And so to remedy this, I would propose the utilization of pre-diabetic screening tests, such as the A1C, fasting plasma glucose, or even the oral glucose tolerance test. Another one of my objectives would be to search for alternative biomarkers which can be used to predict the onset of insulin resistance, but this could be made difficult because of the fact that these biomarkers might be pretty hard to isolate from human subjects, to culture, and even to assay. And so to remedy that, I thought we could utilize research from mammalian model organisms to search for alternative biomarkers. These model organisms would most likely have a lot of the same biochemical reactions and at least similar physiology for us to be able to draw some type of conclusions. And so they also might be easier to isolate culture and assay from these model organisms. And third, studies investigating the link between insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease lack sufficient data from Black Americans with insulin resistance. And so to remedy that, I propose conducting a longitudinal study with a cohort of patients from diverse ethnic backgrounds. I have two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is if the TG-HDLC ratio accurately assesses risk for developing insulin resistance in white Americans and fails to do so for Black Americans, and we evaluate other biomarkers of insulin resistance, then prevention of type 2 diabetes will improve in both populations. My second hypothesis, if insulin resistance leads to diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and screening tests are administered to insulin-resistant patients as preventative measures, then fewer Black Americans will die from cardiovascular disease. So right now I want to take the time to highlight some data from a study from researchers Lopez Neyman, and they wanted to investigate the prevalence of cardiometabolic factors, risk factors across multiple populations. And so here what we have a graph here that is showing measurements of HDL, triglyceride levels, C-reactive protein, things like that. But what is most important about this to note, which I highlighted in red, I annotated here. So the red marks indicate the triglyceride level for each population. And as you can see, for the Black population, the triglycerides levels, which is a cardiometabolic risk factor, it's the lowest, which also highlights the reason to maybe rethink this whole triglyceride HDLC measurement. So to summarize the results of the research that Lopez Neyman did, they concluded that the prevalence of CVD and cardiometabolic risk factors varied across ethnic groups. Additionally, hypertension and obesity were the most prevalent CVD risk factors for adults in the study, with non-Hispanic Blacks disproportionately experiencing these cardiovascular risk factors. Non-Hispanic Blacks had the lowest prevalence of triglyceride levels, 9.1% for the race and ethnic groups. Now on to some conclusions here. So to conclude, the TG-HDLC ratio definitely, without a doubt, demonstrates higher efficacy in the detection of insulin resistance in white Americans than compared to Black Americans. The progression from insulin resistance to diabetes and ultimately cardiovascular disease can be preventable across various ethnic and racial groups with improved screening. Also, what is noteworthy is the lack of inclusion of medical data for diverse populations in research. Replacing the TG-HDLC ratio with a more efficient screening tool could potentially save lives and lower healthcare costs for millions of people. And finally, onto future directions. So I feel like the implementation of health scores, which actually is something that is already utilized when assessing risk for developing other conditions. You take data from, you can even do it in one population. It doesn't have to be racial or ethnic group. You take measurements and you apply statistical analyses. You come up with a number, and this might be a better way to indicate the risk factors instead of relying on a testing for a biomarker that just it doesn't really hold up the same way. So that could be something, an implementation of a health score. Also, future research should maybe focus on the reduction of health disparities among racial and ethnic groups. I think, part of the way to do that, maybe we can do if there is a meta-analysis, and just with a little bit of fine tuning, we can really hone in on some weak areas in the healthcare system. And then finally, I believe that future research should maybe really focus in on triglyceride physiology, since it varies so much by race. I feel like that would be a really important thing to do. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. That's my presentation.